So I've made a bunch of videos talking through many different players, either positively or negatively, over the past 6 weeks. So today, before the final weekend of fantasy football drafts, heading into week 1 of the 2025 NFL season, I narrowed down all of my favorite players to draft into one video. Guys that I believe are 100% guarantees to break out and win fantasy football leagues this year. So here is a look at 8 players that I am drafting in every single league that you should too. The first player is a guy that I am just completely enamored with in Bengals running back Chase Brown. Personally, I believe that Chase Brown is a lock for a top 10 fantasy season at the running back position this year, with the absolute upside to be a top 5 guy or in a league-winning tier of running backs where he joins Bijan and Gibbs and Achane and Christian McCaffrey and Derrick Henry, guys like that who are being drafted way ahead of Chase Brown right now. Last year, from week 6 on, Chase Brown averaged over 18 fantasy points per game as the RB7 over that stretch. But if you look at his averages from week 9 on, because those are the weeks where he played a minimum of 70% of snaps, he was on pace for over 1,300 rushing yards, 600 receiving yards, and 12 total touchdowns, averaging 20.5 fantasy points per game as a top 4 fantasy running back. It was Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Chase Brown as the only running backs to average over 20 fantasy points per game over the second half of last season. We know that the Bengals defense is still terrible, which means they're going to have to score more points to keep up with teams and win games, which means quicker drives, more scoring opportunities, more receiving opportunities, all of which equals more fantasy points for Chase Brown. We've already been hearing about Brown's increased usage in the receiving game from training camp so far. He already had over 50 receptions last year for over 350 yards, but Jeremy Fowler from ESPN is reporting that we should expect an uptick in that usage and be a safety valve for Joe Burrow in the screen game when defenses are really focusing on Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. That receiving usage is part of the reason why Chase Brown was so elite for fantasy football at end last year, because from that stretch, from week 9 on, Brown paced for 80 receptions and over 600 receiving yards. If he's going to do that or more over 17 games this year, I mean, that is everything for fantasy football. Since 2002, every single running back with at least 100 carries and 80 receptions have finished inside the top 10. 12 of the 13 running backs with at least 200 carries and 80 receptions finished as top 3 running backs. The last player to have 200 plus carries and 80 plus receptions in a single season was Austin Eckler in 2022 as the fantasy RB1, which is also interesting because the Bengals offensive coordinator literally compared Chase Brown to Austin Eckler just a week ago. Listen, Chase Brown is the most elite running back who is nowhere near elite running back prices. He is discount Jahmyr Gibbs, and the fact that you can get him right now in the early 3rd round of drafts is absolutely crazy. Sometimes even in the late 3rd, depending on the platform that you draft on. Targeting Chase Brown in the 3rd round allows you to draft elite wide receivers early in round 1 and round 2, then come back to round 3 and grab Chase Brown as your RB1. I actually just did this in my home league, drafting from this 4 spot in a 12-team league. I got CeeDee Lamb at the 104, Drake London at the 2.09, and then Chase Brown at 3.04. And I felt ecstatic about that core to start my fantasy draft. Now, the next running back with legendary upside is new Patriots rookie running back TreVeyon Henderson, who, if you watched at all at Ohio State over the last few years, you know this kid is just dripping with talent and potential. He was phenomenal as a freshman in 2021, rushing for over 1,200 yards and 15 touchdowns as the immediate RB1 for Ohio State at 18 years old. Then he was plagued by some injuries in 2022 and 2023, but was still productive when he played those years. And then 2024, sharing the backfield with Quinshon Judkins, Henderson rushed for over 1,000 yards at 7.1 yards per carry and caught 27 passes for 284 yards and a touchdown through the air for over 10 yards per reception. He's 5'10", 202 pounds, runs a 4.4 40, and has excellent burst and acceleration to end drives on any given play. And now that he's in New England, he has an opportunity to be, at worst, a really good RB1B to Ramondre Stevenson and more of a receiver out of the backfield, but at best, he can absolutely take over this backfield as the main RB1, a la Aaron Jones in Green Bay or Austin Eckler with the LA Chargers. We all know that Mike Vrabel wants to run the ball, and they also brought back offensive coordinator Josh McDaniels, who in 2020 and 2021, without Tom Brady on the Patriots, had a double-digit touchdown rusher on the team. In 2020, it was Cam Newton with 12 rushing touchdowns. In 2021, it was Damian Harris with 15 rushing touchdowns. and not to mention that Josh Jacobs had 12 rushing touchdowns under McDaniels in 2022. Let's also not forget that one of Henderson's biggest strengths is the receiving game, where it's being reported all training camp that he's just torching defenders out of the backfield on wheel routes, on top of taking handoffs to the house. And we can't talk about pass catching running backs under Josh McDaniels without bringing up James White's effectiveness in the receiving game, having multiple 60-plus reception seasons, including 1 year with 87 receptions for 750 yards and 8 touchdowns as the RB7 in fantasy football. Let's also not forget that with the Vegas Raiders, Josh Jacobs had 57 receptions in 2022, and Raiders running backs as a whole totaled over 100 targets as a group in 2022 and in 2023, both years under Josh McDaniels. Ramondre Stevenson has been an ineffective workhorse for 2 years in a row now. He's not gotten over 4 yards per carry. He's only scored 12 times over the last 2 years combined, yet he still received a heavy workload and a healthy receiving workload as well. So if Henderson starts to take over as the main RB1 for the Patriots in an improved offense, with an improved offensive line, with year 2 of Drake May, with better weapons around him, TreVeyon Henderson could have a league-winning type of rookie season that we see pretty much every single year. Sticking with the running back position, another top 24 selection last year who busted due to injuries was Isiah Pacheco, who went down in week 2 with a broken fibula, and when he returned in week 13 was a shell of his former self and was not worth having on your roster, let alone actually playing him in the fantasy playoffs. But now we're on to 2025. He's had a full offseason to get healthy and strong, and all reports out of training camp are saying that he looks like he's back to where he was before the injury, which, in case you don't remember, he put up 16 fantasy points in week 1, 16 fantasy points again in week 2 before getting hurt as the Chiefs' workhorse running back. It's only a 2-game sample, but his pace from those games would have been 290 carries, 60 receptions, 1,600 total yards, and 8 to 9 touchdowns. That is a pretty great stat line for a player that you can get in the late 6th or even 7th round of your drafts right now. I know people only remember the last things they saw from Isiah Pacheco, which was horrendously bad and inefficient production to end the season, and then even worse production in the playoffs and Super Bowl last year. But that was to be expected coming off of the injury. A broken fibula is not to be messed with, and even though it's a quick recovery of just a few weeks before they can get back on the field, the ramifications for a return to production are massive. A broken fibula is the same injury that Tony Pollard suffered at the end of 2022, and even though he had an offseason to recover, his start to the 2023 season was terrible and inefficient in Dallas as the RB23 in points per game through the first 10 weeks, with only 3 games over 55 rushing yards. It wasn't until mid-November that we started seeing the real Tony Pollard again. He even said as much around Thanksgiving that he started to feel like himself around that time. From week 11 on, Tony Pollard averaged 1.2 more fantasy points per game than he did at the beginning of the year and was a top 15 fantasy running back. Then he went to Tennessee last year and was a top 20 guy again. A broken fibula is also the same injury that Mark Andrews suffered in November of 2023, and despite having an offseason to recover, still wasn't the same to start 2024. People were dropping him last year because he donutted you 2 games in a row in week 3 and week 4. But from week 5 on, Andrews started coming back and he paced for 800 yards and 14 touchdowns, producing as the tight end 5 for 75% of the season last year. So for Isiah Pacheco, who already got a lot of his inefficient and his bad games out of the way by being able to return last year, plus then having the entire offseason to regain his strength, we could see him get back to where he was in 2023 and for the first 2 games of 2024, especially when his competition for touches in the backfield is a 30-year-old Kareem Hunt, who was also very inefficient last year at 3.6 yards per carry, Elijah Mitchell, who always seems to be injured, and then a 7th-round rookie, who I've even seen some Chiefs beat reporters question if Brashard Smith is even going to make the team this year. The Chiefs did nothing this offseason to show that they lost faith in Isiah Pacheco, and now that you can draft him in round 6 or round 7 as a 4 to 5 round discount from last year, you shouldn't lose faith either. This video is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. We're running out of time, folks. Draft season is almost over, and we here at 4for4 are already in full prep mode. This year on 4for4, we are playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too. Whether you're a first-timer or a veteran creating your millionth league, it is the platform that we trust every season for smooth drafts, solid tools, and easy league management. With season kickoff on September 4th, now is the time to start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football, which offers so many fun ways to compete. Want more ways to play? Try the brand new Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine League mode, where the lowest scored team gets eliminated each week until one team is left standing. Want to play instantly with friends? Try the new Draft with Friends mode. Prefer the classics? Get your crew together and go head-to-head in a private league. No crew? No problem. Join a public league, the easiest way to play fantasy football. Play now at yahoofantasy.com/tmap. That is yahoofantasy.com/TMAP. Now, next on this video should come at no surprise if you watched my breakout wide receiver video. It is new Panthers rookie wide receiver Tet McMillan, who's drafted in the first round, 8th overall in the 2025 draft, and fills a massive and immediate need on the Panthers offense at wide receiver. Tet McMillan is a 3-year early declare out of Arizona who had back-to-back seasons of 1,300 plus yards as a sophomore and junior and scored 8 or more touchdowns in all 3 years. He is a beast of a player at 6'4", 220 pounds, runs a sub 4.5, is a great route runner, can make all of the contested catches and moss defenders on the sideline, plus has sneaky yak ability that you don't often see from players his size. In the Dynasty streets, the popular comparisons for him as a prospect were Mike Evans, Drake London, T. Higgins, and even a little bit of Nico Collins. Just these big-bodied ex-wide receivers who can become the focal point of an offense on the outside, but also have some flexibility to move around the formation a little bit too. So for a player as pedigreed as Tet McMillan to then join an NFL offense as desperate for wide receiver help as the Carolina Panthers, in year 2 of a Dave Canales offense, the sky is really the limit here. The talent gap between Tet McMillan and the rest of the Panthers receivers is massive, and combine that with the passing volume that we know Carolina is going to have because they're going to be a bad team, they're going to have to throw more. Who is the one player that is far and away the most talented and quarterback-friendly guy to throw to on that team? It is Tet McMillan. If you're looking for this year's Brian Thomas Jr., an absolute alpha wide receiver 1 in a bad offense with minimal competition around him, that this year is Tet McMillan. Emeka Egbuka, who is rising rapidly in ADP over the past couple of weeks and probably won't be a double-digit pick come late August, especially after the news of Chris Godwin's second surgery in June and probably not going to be ready to start the year. Plus, now the clip of Baker Mayfield talking him up on the Kelsey podcast.
And Emeka Egbuka is an absolute stud. He's a real deal. You know how you just can't teach guys leaving the ground to catch the ball? He's always grounded when he catches it, keeps moving. There's yak potential out the wazoo there, but he's just so damn smart. I mean, he's willing to block, willing to do everything we ask him to do, but then, I mean, we can plug and play him at any of the 3 receiver spots right now.
Emeka Egbuka was drafted to be a continuation of wide receiver talent in Tampa Bay. They knew that Chris Godwin's injury was serious enough to hamper him this year, so Emeka could fill that role in the short term. But also, Mike Evans is aging and has dealt with some injuries recently too, that they also then have Egbuka for the long term to pair with Chris Godwin when he's fully healthy in 2026 and 2027. But there is a world where Egbuka is just too good to keep off the field this year in 2025. Like I said, if he's kind of filling that Chris Godwin role early on, he could be an impact player immediately. Then, if Evans takes a step back this year or even gets hurt again, Egbuka will be right there again to be a weekly wide receiver 2 with upside. There are just so many paths for Egbuka to hit this year that he could be a massive contributor to every team that he's on from week 1 to week 17. Now, the next receiver I want to talk about is a player that I found myself buying back into this year because of his new situation and just believing that, yeah, this is going to be pretty good, and that is DK Metcalf. Last year, we all wanted to find reasons why Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry and Josh Jacobs switching teams was actually a bad thing for them. They're getting older. Running backs switching teams that late in their careers don't usually work well, blah, 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 blah. Guess what? None of it mattered because all 3 of those guys went to vastly improved teams and situations and absolutely balled out for fantasy football. We should have seen those seasons coming. So when I look at DK Metcalf and his situation for 2025, I can't help but think that all the peripheral stuff just doesn't matter. And it's going to work and work well in Pittsburgh, at least for 2025. Aaron Rodgers is the best quarterback that DK Metcalf has had since Russell Wilson at the start of DK Metcalf's career. No, he's not the Aaron Rodgers from the 2010s, but he's still good enough to give us elite fantasy production at the wide receiver position. In 2021, Davante Adams was the fantasy wide receiver 2 at 29 years old with over 1,500 yards and 11 touchdowns. He had 169 targets, while the next closest Packers receiver, who's actually Aaron Jones at the running back position, was at 65 targets. So Davante Adams had over 100 targets more than the second most targeted guy that year. In 2022, without Davante Adams in Green Bay, Rodgers did suffer from not having any good wide receivers, but Allen Lazard was a top 35 fantasy wide receiver with almost 12 PPR points per game while putting up 800 yards and 6 touchdowns on 100 targets, nearly 30 more than the next highest targeted player that season. 2023 was, of course, the Achilles year, but 2024, Garrett Wilson was the fantasy wide receiver 10 overall with 154 targets, and Davante Adams was the fantasy wide receiver 11 with 114 targets on the New York Jets, or a 17-game pace of 176 targets just from playing with Aaron Rodgers. Those two receivers alone combined for 268 targets last year, while everybody else combined for 303 targets on the New York Jets. Aaron Rodgers has and will continue hyper-targeting one guy, and that's usually a pretty great thing for fantasy football. And that guy this year is DK Metcalf, who's also just head and shoulders better than everybody else the Pittsburgh Steelers have to catch the ball. And my entire X timeline right now is just filled with highlight reel catches from DK Metcalf in training camp, and it also helps that Aaron Rodgers and DK Metcalf are rooming together in Latrobe. Prior to last year's wide receiver 32 finish, Metcalf had finished as the wide receiver 7, wide receiver 14, wide receiver 16, and wide receiver 21 the previous 4 years. That wide receiver 7 year was the one year that he kind of put everything together. He had 83 receptions, over 1,300 yards, 10 receiving touchdowns. Then the next 3 years after that, he was never able to put everything together once again. He either had 12 touchdowns, but he didn't break 1,000 yards. He either had 140 targets and 90 receptions, but he only scored 6 times. Or he did have 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns, but only on 66 receptions. That's why he's never been more than a solid fantasy wide receiver 2 since. But put him in an offense as Aaron Rodgers is hyper-targeted guy with absolutely zero competition behind him, and it's possible that he gets back inside the top 10 and for fantasy this year, just like Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson were last year and in Green Bay. Going in the late 4th or even 5th round in ADP on all platforms, Metcalf is a tremendous target for anyone who starts the draft with 1 or even 2 running backs or an early tight end, and you're looking for upside at your wide receiver 2, maybe even your wide receiver 1 spot in that 4-5 turn. Even if you have a start, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, going wide receiver, running back, I'll take DK Metcalf as my flex option in the 4th round, and then I'll attack running back and tight end in the mid rounds to really fill out my roster. Now, the next guy on the list is Calvin Ridley, a guy who's pretty much in the same situation as Tet McMillan, but with a proven track record of either very good to even elite NFL success on multiple teams throughout his career. He finished as the wide receiver 18 in 2023 in Jacksonville and was the wide receiver 28 last year in Tennessee. Hasn't always been pretty, but being the wide receiver 1 on a bad team with very little target competition offers a solid weekly floor, plus then the upside of bigger weeks from explosive plays and touchdowns. And that path for Calvin Ridley this year is centered around the addition of rookie quarterback Cam Ward, who is so much better than the combination of Will Levis and Mason Rudolph. Ward, also a gunslinger, willing to take chances on big throws just like Levis and Rudolph did, but Ward is at least accurate on those throws, and the propensity for turnovers is a lot lower. The way I see it, we basically have 2 possible ceiling outcomes for Calvin Ridley this year with a rookie quarterback, both being reflections of performances that we saw last year from receivers with rookie quarterbacks last year. The first of which is Courtland Sutton, which I don't know if people realize this, but Sutton was the wide receiver 15 last year in PPR formats with almost 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns on 135 targets. That production isn't really all that different from Calvin Ridley's last year, especially if we presume that Ward is a better and more accurate passer than Levis and Rudolph and raises Ridley's catch percentage from a putrid 53% last year up closer to around 60% where Courtland Sutton was last year. If you give Ridley an extra 10 to 15 receptions on his end of season total last year, he's a top 18 fantasy wide receiver. The other ceiling outcome for Ridley is being this year's version of Terry McLaurin, who succeeded massively with a new and much better rookie quarterback. The funny thing about McLaurin's 2024 season, though, is it wasn't really much different from all his other seasons in the receptions and receiving yardage categories, but 13 touchdowns, nearly doubled his previous career high, and was almost as many as he had in the previous 3 seasons combined. That, plus a 70% catch percentage, led to insane efficiency all over the field, especially in the red zone. So, if Cam Ward is able to elevate this Titans offense to a whole different level, Ridley would be the primary benefactor of that and could be a league winner at 7th round prices in drafts with higher efficiency, big play capabilities, and more scoring opportunities. Now, we are on a 2-year streak of a rookie tight end finishing as the overall tight end 1 in fantasy football, with Sam Laporta in 2023, then of course Brock Bowers last year in 2024. And I have to say, we have 2 very good candidates from this year's rookie class to try to make it a three-peat. But if I had to put my chips down on one of them being the tight end 1 this year, I would pick Colts tight end Tyler Warren out of Penn State. Now, if you did not watch Penn State last year, you missed out on a phenomenal season from Tyler Warren with over 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns receiving, plus another 200 yards and 4 touchdowns rushing, and 1 passing touchdown too. He was everywhere, did everything for Penn State, including catching a touchdown pass on a play that he snapped the ball. There was no shortage of creativity in getting the ball into Tyler Warren's hands because they knew all they had to do was just get him the ball. And that's my hope for how Indianapolis is going to use him this year. Line him up outside, line him up in the slot, in line next to a tackle, in the backfield at fullback, anywhere and everywhere, and just put the ball in Tyler Warren's hands. I know the quarterback situation is not great in Indianapolis right now, but it also wasn't great for Brock Bowers either, and he was just too much of a beast, catching a ton of passes that he was still able to be the fantasy tight end 1. Warren is versatile and talented enough to catch design screen passes in the backfield and get a first down, win a route against a linebacker over the middle of the field, moss a defensive back on the sideline, or just be a huge target in the end zone for whoever ends up being the quarterback for Indianapolis. Or just give him the ball on a handoff or like a jet sweep inside the 5 and score that way like he did at Penn State too. We're spending all offseason debating if Josh Downs can break out in year 3, debating if Michael Pittman has any juice left to even be worth drafting, or if Alec Pierce or Adonai Mitchell are going to do anything this year. But all of those questions might just lead to the answer being Tyler Warren as the main guy. The safety blanket, the chain mover, the red zone threat, the versatile weapon anywhere on the field. How do you not take a shot on an uber talented do-it-all rookie who is drafted in the top 15 of the NFL draft? If you've waited this long to take a tight end, you're probably streaming the position anyway, so why not draft a guy who could ascend out of streamer territory and into an elite weekly starter?